Ava stood on the street, her bruised face a silent cry, but her words rang out through the silence. "Can you be my dad for one day?" Ava, just 9 years old and carrying the scars of both abuse and abandonment, stands before Vincenzo, the ruthless godfather whose reputation echoes through every corner of the city. The request she makes to him, simple yet piercing, shocks him to his core. As her trembling hands clutch her worn backpack, she asks for something she has been denied her whole life: a protector. Vincenzo, the man who commands fear and loyalty, finds himself at a crossroads. He had built his empire on power, violence, and control, but Ava's words stir something unexpected within him. What follows is not just a moment of pity, but a shift in the very foundation of his world. The Mafia men, who had been his brothers in arms, will now become a family for a child in desperate need of salvation. Ava's plea ignites a fire that will change not just her future, but the lives of those around her. The Godfather and his men stand ready to give her the one thing she's never had: a father, even if for just one day. But in the world they live in, promises like that come at a cost. Ava's steps echoed through the empty street, each one heavy with a burden far beyond her years. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, painting the world in shades of gray and gold, but to her, everything felt distant, unreal. She was alone, yet she wasn't. The bruises on her face, a dark purple mark under her right eye, throbbed with each movement, but it was nothing compared to the weight she carried inside. The pain in her body was nothing compared to the pain she carried in her heart. The street was silent when she reached the door of the old, weathered building. It stood imposing, the kind of place you didn't go unless you had no choice. Ava had heard the whispers, seen the cold glances cast in her direction, but today she wasn't here for anyone else's approval. She needed something, someone. Her tiny hand reached out, trembling just slightly as she pushed the door open. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, the room dimly lit, a contrast to the sunlight that had welcomed her outside. The men inside were hardened, their eyes sharp with experience, their faces carved with the lines of violence and power. The moment she stepped in, the noise stopped. The chatter, the clinking of glasses, the shuffle of boots, all of it faded as the room locked eyes on her. Vincenzo sat at the far end of the room, behind a large wooden desk, his back straight, hands folded, as if he were carved from stone. His dark suit was immaculate, his presence overwhelming, the kind of man who made the air feel thick with authority. He was the Godfather, the leader of this empire, and for all his power, Ava could see it in his eyes. Something was there, something deeper than the hard mask he wore for the world. For just a second, his gaze softened. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. She'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, played it out in her head over and over, wondering what she would say, how she would look, but now that she was here, words escaped her. Her eyes dropped to the floor, ashamed of the weakness she felt. The memories of home, of Dale, her mother's boyfriend, flooded her mind, the anger, the shouting, the slaps. She didn't want to be weak. She couldn't afford to show fear, but she couldn't carry this alone anymore. With a deep breath, she lifted her head and looked straight at Vincenzo. Her voice, though small, rang out clear and steady in the heavy silence. "Can you be my dad? For just one day?" she asked, the words barely more than a whisper, but cutting through the air like a blade. There it was, the request, the words she never thought she'd be brave enough to say. But as soon as they left her mouth, a strange calm settled over her. The room was still, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't the abused, the neglected child. For this moment, she was just a little girl asking for help. Vincenzo didn't move, his gaze still fixed on her, but the air shifted. There was a moment, brief but intense, when she thought he might turn her away, send her back to the world that had already broken her. But then, something in his eyes shifted, just a fraction, as though her words had cracked something inside him. The weight of her plea hung between them, powerful, undeniable. "Come here, Ava," he said, his voice low, rough with emotion, but calm. "We'll talk." And in that moment, everything changed. Ava stood there, her heart racing as Vincenzo's eyes never left hers. He motioned for her to sit across from him, and she hesitated, her small frame feeling too big in the vast room. But as she sat down, the memories came rushing back, the walls of the building around her fading as her mind returned to a time before this place, before Vincenzo. The black eye was a reminder, a constant, aching reminder. But it wasn't the worst of it. At home, it was always loud. The slamming of doors, the shouting that rattled the thin walls of the apartment, the sound of Dale's voice cutting through the silence. Ava learned early on how to stay small, how to shrink herself into nothing so she wouldn't be seen, wouldn't be noticed. She could hear the drunken slur of his words, see the flash of his temper as he stumbled through the door after another long night out. He never touched her mother when he was sober, but when the alcohol took hold, everything changed. Ava had learned not to cry. The beatings didn't stop when she cried. They got worse. But the worst part? The worst part was always the silence afterward. The silence that settled in the room like a heavy weight, where Ava had to listen to her mother beg him not to leave, not to hurt her, while Ava sat huddled in the corner, wishing it would all stop, but it never did. And then there was school, a place where she tried to escape the chaos, only to find a different kind of torment waiting for her. Nicholas, a boy in her class, had taken an immediate liking to her. Not the kind of liking a friend would show, but the kind that made her wish she could disappear. He would push her into lockers when the halls were empty, call her names like orphan girl, and steal her lunch when no one was looking. She remembered the time he grabbed the dog tags her father had worn in the army, laughing as he tossed them into the trash. Ava had dug through the garbage for hours, her hands trembling as she retrieved them, the sharp sting of humiliation burning her chest. But it wasn't just Nicholas. The whole school seemed to turn a blind eye to her. Teachers looked the other way when she came in with bruises, too afraid of crossing the line. No one asked. No one cared. Ava's chest tightened as she thought of those long days when she felt invisible, when she wished for someone to see her, to understand. But all she had were the whispers of the other kids, their cold glances and mocking laughs. She was nothing to them, nothing at all. Then there was Vincenzo. His presence in the room, the deep, unsettling calm in his eyes, made Ava's heart pound. He wasn't like anyone she had ever known. He wasn't like Dale or Nicholas or the teachers who ignored her. He wasn't afraid to see the truth. He was a man who understood pain and power, who had built a world around him that was as dark as it was strong. Yet, when she spoke, he listened. She knew the pain wouldn't end here, that this moment didn't fix everything. But for the first time, she felt like someone had heard her. For the first time, she wasn't just a little girl caught in a cycle of violence and silence. She was someone worth fighting for. Vincenzo sat at his desk, the weight of Ava's request still hanging in the air. The room felt smaller, suffocating even, as the other men stood in silence, their faces unreadable, their loyalty never in question. The quiet hum of the city outside seemed distant, as if it belonged to another world entirely. In here, there was only the matter of Ava, the little girl with the black eye, the child who had come into their world with nothing but a simple, desperate plea. His fingers traced the edge of the glass on his desk, the smooth surface a contrast to the rough, jagged memories that seemed to claw at him. He could still hear her voice, soft but determined, asking for something he never thought he'd be asked, for protection, for a father, for a way out. His mind raced through the possibilities. This wasn't just some passing whim of a troubled child. This was something deeper. Her pain, her fear, it had carved lines through her soul. He could see it now, even more clearly than before. She wasn't just a victim of a broken home, of a violent man who had no right to call himself a father. She was a child who had been abandoned over and over again by everyone she should have been able to trust. And that, Vincenzo knew, was something he couldn't allow. The silence in the room thickened, stretching between the men like a taut wire, until finally, Robert, the oldest of the crew and the most seasoned in the ways of life's darker paths, broke it. "She's one of ours now," Robert said, his voice low but unwavering. "We don't turn our backs on family." Vincenzo met his gaze, the weight of his decision pressing harder with every passing second. The men in this room, they were his family, bound by blood, loyalty, and an understanding of what it meant to survive in a world that had no place for the weak. He had built this empire with them, forged through blood and sacrifice. But Ava, she wasn't part of the empire. She wasn't a pawn in a game of power or control. She was a child. "Agreed," Vincenzo said, the finality of his words settling in the room. "We can't let her go back to that life. Not while we can do something about it." The men around him nodded, their faces hard but resolute. Each of them had seen their fair share of injustice, had been victims of a world that took more than it ever gave. They had come from broken homes, or no homes at all, and they had survived, not because they were stronger, but because they had learned the value of protection, of standing by each other when the world wanted to tear them apart. "Dale," Ben, the next in command, spoke up, his voice a mixture of anger and disgust. "He's got to go. And that kid at school, Nicholas, we make it clear to everyone that no one messes with her." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. Vincenzo leaned back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. He could feel the weight of his decision lifting, replaced by something sharper, something colder. This was no longer just about protecting a child, it was about sending a message. And in this world, messages were what kept people alive. "We handle this," Vincenzo said, his voice a promise, "and we do it right. No one touches her again. Not ever." The men in the room knew what that meant. It meant swift justice. It meant the kind of protection only they could offer. And it meant that Ava, in that moment, had become part of their family, a family bound by something much stronger than blood. Vincenzo stood, his jaw set with determination. "Prepare for tomorrow. We make sure she never feels like she's alone again." And with that, the decision was made. The weight of it hung in the air, but for the first time in years, Vincenzo felt something stirring within him, a kind of resolve he hadn't known he still had. This wasn't just about the Mafia anymore. This was about saving a child from a life she didn't deserve. And Vincenzo would make sure she got that chance, no matter what it took. The night before career day, the air in the clubhouse was thick with purpose. The usual sounds of clinking bottles and muffled conversation were replaced by the steady hum of men moving with intent. Vincenzo paced, his mind racing over the plan. Tomorrow wasn't just a school event. It wasn't just about showing up for Ava. This was about making a statement, about letting everyone in that school know that Ava was not alone, that no one could hurt her without facing the full weight of the men who had chosen to stand by her. Each member of the mob had their role to play. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The men in this room had lived through enough that words weren't necessary. They had all faced pain and abandonment. They understood what it meant to fight for someone who couldn't protect themselves. Vincenzo stopped at the large map on the wall, his fingers tracing the route to Ava's school. He wasn't just planning an entrance. He was preparing to send a message to anyone who would dare cross her again. "Ben, you take point," Vincenzo said, his voice steady but intense. "Make sure the cars are ready. We'll arrive in full force, no delays. Make it clear that we're not here to play." Ben nodded, his jaw clenched. He wasn't a man who spoke much, but when it came to protecting family, his actions said everything. He had been through enough wars, both in the streets and within his own mind. His loyalty was unquestionable. "Tommy, you and Diego handle the school perimeter. Get eyes on the inside, too. I don't want any surprises, not tomorrow." Tommy, tall and broad, gave a sharp nod. His experience in handling the unpredictable was invaluable. Diego, younger but no less deadly, added, "We'll make sure the halls are clear. No one makes a move without us knowing." Vincenzo turned to the others in the room. "Everyone else, keep your phones on. Stay alert. This is Ava's day, and we're going to make it count." There was a brief moment of silence, a stillness that hung in the air like the calm before a storm. Then Robert, always the voice of reason, spoke. "She's a kid, Vincenzo," Robert said, his gravelly voice cutting through the tension. "Don't forget why we're doing this. She doesn't need to see us as soldiers, not tomorrow. She just needs to know we're there." Vincenzo's eyes softened for a moment. He understood. He hadn't planned to make the spectacle so grand, but the weight of the world seemed to be on her shoulders. He needed to show her that she was worth fighting for, that she wasn't just a child lost in a cruel world. She was part of something greater, and no one would touch her again without facing the wrath of his men. "You're right," Vincenzo said after a beat, "but we're not going in quietly. Tomorrow, everyone knows who's got her back." He paced again, his mind circling the plan. The bikers would roll in first, loud, overwhelming. Their engines would roar like a war drum, signaling that something powerful was about to unfold. The school would tremble beneath the force of their presence, and when the mob walked into that room, it wouldn't just be a show of strength, it would be an unspoken vow. No one would ever hurt Ava again. As the men dispersed to finalize the details, Vincenzo stood at the center of the room, the weight of the decision heavy in his chest. Tomorrow, they would make their move. Tomorrow, they would protect her, and no one would dare to question their loyalty. Ava would see firsthand the kind of family she had just gained, one bound by blood, loyalty, and unbreakable bonds. The morning of career day arrived with an unspoken tension in the air. The usual buzz of school life, the hurried chatter of students in the hallways, the clatter of lockers opening and closing, seemed distant, muffled by an undercurrent of something more. Ava stood at her locker, hands trembling as she adjusted her shirt, the one her mom had bought for her father's funeral. It felt too big for her, too heavy, like everything else in her life. She tried not to think about the stares, the whispers that followed her everywhere. The bullies, especially Nicholas, were already waiting. They always were. She could already hear their taunts, the cruel nicknames, the mocking laughter. But today felt different. Today, something inside her had shifted. She didn't know what to expect. The promise Vincenzo had made to her, the one that had somehow calmed the storm in her heart, felt unreal. But as she walked through the crowded halls, her footsteps no longer echoed with the weight of loneliness. There was a spark of hope in her chest, a quiet belief that maybe, just maybe, this day would be different. A soft rumble reached her ears, low at first, distant but growing louder with each passing second. It started as a murmur, the kind of sound that made her heart race. She froze, her hand still resting on her locker, and turned toward the window. Outside, the unmistakable roar of engines reverberated through the walls of the school. The motorcycles, the bikers had arrived. Ava's breath caught in her throat as the sound grew louder, closer, the unmistakable hum of dozens of powerful engines shaking the air. And then they appeared. One by one, the motorcycles lined up outside, chrome gleaming under the dull morning light. The engines roared to life in unison, a cacophony of raw power that shook the very ground beneath her feet. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, staring at the spectacle unfolding outside the school. The bikers, the men she had come to trust, were here. And they weren't just here for career day, they were here for her. The sound of their bikes was like a promise, a pledge that she wasn't alone. Not anymore. The hallways went quiet. Even the teachers stopped, frozen in place, as the bikers dismounted from their motorcycles. There were more than Ava had expected. 20 men, each one more imposing than the last. their leather vests adorned with symbols of power and loyalty. The Hells Angels, the very name enough to send chills down anyone's spine, walked toward the school in perfect formation. Their heavy boots hit the ground in synchrony, each step deliberate, purposeful. And then they entered. Ava's heart pounded in her chest as she watched them fill the doorway, their presence filling the room like a storm. The air felt thick, the weight of their gaze heavy. Her bullies, Nicholas included, stopped dead in their tracks. Nicholas's smirk faltered as he looked up, his eyes going wide when he saw the sheer force of men that had come for her. Vincenzo led them in, his steps measured, confident. His eyes scanned the room, his gaze briefly meeting Ava's before moving to the others. "This is Ava's career day," he said, his voice carrying with an authority that seemed to make the room tremble. "And anyone who has a problem with that can speak with us." The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't just the bikers' sighs, their presence. It was their unyielding confidence. They were there for Ava, and in that moment, everyone in the room knew it. The bullies, their families, the teachers, all of them were dwarfed by the force of the men who stood there, unwavering, loyal, ready to protect. Ava's chest tightened, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was something else. Something she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in her life, she felt like she belonged. Like she was seen. And that was enough to make the weight of the day feel a little lighter. Vincenzo's steps were deliberate, echoing through the dimly lit hallway as he moved toward the door. The place was a dilapidated apartment building, worn down by years of neglect, much like the man who lived inside. The air was thick with a faint smell of alcohol and stale cigarettes. Vincenzo's fingers brushed the edge of the door frame, his hand hovering for just a moment before he knocked sharply. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, revealing Dale, Ava's mother's boyfriend. He was a mess. A broad man, unshaven and still wearing the same stained t-shirt he'd had on when Ava had last seen him. His eyes were bleary, the remnants of a night spent drinking lingering in his posture. He looked at Vincenzo, confusion crossing his face as recognition hit. The Godfather, standing tall in the doorway, was not someone you ignored. "Vincenzo," Dale muttered, wiping his hand across his face like he was trying to shake off the fog in his head. "What's this about?" Vincenzo didn't say a word. Instead, he stepped forward, his presence filling the space, pushing the stench of the room into the background. He didn't need to say much. His eyes, cold and unflinching, told Dale everything. "You've hurt her enough," Vincenzo said, his voice low but steady. There was no anger in it, only an undeniable authority. Dale laughed nervously, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "What's your business with my girl? You come in here threatening me now?" Vincenzo's gaze narrowed, and for a moment it seemed like the room itself held its breath. "Your girl?" Vincenzo repeated, as if the words tasted foreign in his mouth. "She's not your girl. She's a child. You'll never lay a hand on her again." Dale's face flushed with a mix of confusion and irritation. "You don't know anything about me," he spat. "I'm just trying to get by. You think you're better than me?" Vincenzo took a step closer, his calm demeanor only increasing the sense of danger. "I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to end this. You've already done enough damage." Dale's expression shifted, and for a split second, something like fear flashed in his eyes. He may not have been afraid of the law, but the Mafia. That was another story entirely. "Listen, I don't know what your problem is, but—" Dale began, but his words were cut off as Vincenzo moved in, his voice a steel thread of quiet menace. "You're leaving, now. You've hurt Ava enough, and you're not going to hurt anyone else. You're going to pack your things, get out, and never come near her again. If I ever hear otherwise, I'll be back. And when I come, it won't be a conversation." Vincenzo's voice dropped to a growl, and the weight of it hung in the air like a storm cloud. Dale opened his mouth to speak, but the words died on his lips as he realized the futility of resistance. Vincenzo had already made his decision. He had nothing left to offer, no way to fight back. Without another word, Vincenzo reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. He tossed it on the kitchen table with a single, swift motion. "This is your choice," he said. "You leave now, and you walk away clean. If you don't, we'll be back, and there won't be a second chance." Dale stood frozen, staring down at the envelope, the weight of his life hanging by a thread. He looked up at Vincenzo, a flicker of realization crossing his face. His bravado had crumbled. There was no way out for him. "I'll be gone in an hour," Dale muttered, his voice smaller now, the bravado completely gone. Vincenzo didn't respond. He turned on his heel and walked toward the door, his back straight, his mission accomplished. When he reached the threshold, he paused, looking back over his shoulder. "You don't deserve her," Vincenzo said, the words final, the message clear. Then, without another glance, he left. As he walked back to the car, the faint sound of Dale's shuffling footsteps echoed behind him. Ava's life was about to change, and no one, least of all her abuser, would ever stand in the way of it again. The days that followed felt different for Ava. The bruise on her face began to fade, but the changes were deeper than what could be seen on her skin. She spent her time at the clubhouse, away from the cruel whispers of school, away from the empty apartment that once felt like a cage. Here, with Vincenzo and the men, there was no need for pretending, no more shrinking into herself, no more hiding behind the weight of her own fears. In this world, she was someone worth protecting. Vincenzo's presence was constant, like the steady pulse of a drumbeat. He wasn't just the Godfather. He was Ava's protector. Every time she saw him, he didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her with something else, respect. He had seen the depths of pain in the world, but Ava, fragile and bruised, was something else. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. Instead, he showed her what it meant to be cared for. One afternoon, Vincenzo took Ava aside after she had spent hours in the garage, watching the men work on the motorcycles. She had always been told that girls weren't meant to get dirty, that they were supposed to sit quietly and wait. But in the clubhouse, there was no such rule. The men treated her as if she belonged there, teaching her how to use the tools, showing her how a wrench worked, how the gears shifted. There was power in it, something she hadn't realized she needed until now, the power of being seen for what she was, not who the world tried to make her. Vincenzo leaned against the wall, watching her, his arms crossed, his gaze soft but steady. "You're learning fast," he said, his voice gruff but warm. "You've got good hands, Ava." She glanced up at him, unsure of how to respond, but something in his tone, something that wasn't just about the mechanics or the motorcycles, made her feel proud. Proud of herself. Proud that someone saw her as capable, as more than the broken girl she had been. I never thought I could do something like this," she admitted, wiping grease off her hands and looking down. "I used to think I wasn't good enough. I never had anyone show me how." Vincenzo pushed off the wall and walked over to her, his boots thudding on the concrete floor. He stopped in front of her, lowering his gaze so that she could see the sincerity in his eyes. "The world will tell you that you're not enough, that you don't belong, but you do. You're more than enough, Ava, and you belong right here, with us." The weight of his words settled into her chest, a warmth she hadn't felt before, blossoming there. For the first time in her life, she felt like she had a place. No longer the overlooked girl, no longer the target for abuse or ridicule. She felt seen, heard, and, most importantly, valued. That night, as Ava lay in the bed in the small room upstairs, her thoughts lingered on Vincenzo's words. Her mind replayed everything, the way he had treated her, the way the other men had shown her respect, how they made her feel like she wasn't alone. She wasn't just an outsider anymore. She wasn't just a scared little girl begging for someone to care. She was a part of something bigger than herself, a family bound not by blood, but by loyalty and choice. And for the first time in a long while, Ava allowed herself to sleep without the weight of fear on her chest. She was safe now, safe in a way she hadn't known before. Safe with people who would fight for her, who would never let her go. The world outside might have been dark, but inside the clubhouse, Ava had found the light she had been searching for. She had found her family, and for once, it was enough. Ava woke up to the sound of the engines rumbling outside the clubhouse, a familiar comfort she had grown used to. The morning light filtered through the cracked blinds, casting long shadows on the floor. She stretched, her body still sore from the hours spent working on the bikes the day before, but there was something different now, something that had been missing for so long. For the first time in her life, she woke up feeling like she belonged somewhere, like she had a place in this world that wasn't defined by pain. Her time at the clubhouse had become more than just a refuge from her past. It was where she learned what it meant to have people who cared, people who would stand by her no matter what. Vincenzo and the others never treated her like a burden, never looked at her with pity. They treated her like she mattered, like she had something to offer. They had made her part of their world, and in doing so, they had given her a strength she didn't know she had. At school, things had started to shift. It wasn't instant, but with each passing day, Ava felt more confident. The bullying hadn't completely stopped, but it had lessened. Nicholas no longer had the power to taunt her without consequences. His smirks faltered every time he saw her walk through the halls, her head held high, the weight of her new family's protection wrapping around her like armor. Ava's teachers began to notice the change as well. She wasn't the quiet, withdrawn girl she had been before. She was answering questions in class now, participating in discussions, her voice steady and clear. When she made a mistake, she didn't shrink away in embarrassment. She took a deep breath and tried again. And when her classmates noticed, when they stopped whispering behind her back and started treating her like just another kid, Ava realized something. She had the power to change the way she saw herself. One afternoon after school, Vincenzo took her aside, his voice low, filled with pride. "You're doing well, Ava," he said, "but remember, confidence isn't just about standing tall. It's about knowing that even when the world tries to knock you down, you stand back up, and you've done that." Ava looked up at him, feeling a surge of gratitude flood her chest. "I never thought I could," she admitted, her voice quiet. "I always thought I was just not good enough." "You are more than enough," Vincenzo replied, his gaze steady, unwavering. "And you always have been. Don't let anyone, not even your own doubts, tell you otherwise." The words sunk in deeper than any had before. For the first time, Ava felt truly seen, not just for her scars or the bruises she carried, but for the girl she was becoming. A girl who could stand tall, who could fight back when life tried to knock her down. Her transformation wasn't just about the way she carried herself at school. It was about how she carried herself in the world. She wasn't the broken girl from before, cowering in the shadows. She was someone who had found strength in the most unexpected of places, in the loyalty of men who had no obligation to protect her, but who had chosen to. By the time the next school year rolled around, Ava was no longer just surviving. She was thriving. She had friends who admired her, teachers who respected her, and most importantly, a family who would never let her fall. The girl who had once walked through life invisible was now someone the world couldn't ignore, and that was a power no one could take from her. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft glow over the city when Ava stepped outside the clubhouse, her feet brushing against the gravel as she made her way toward the bikes. The morning air was still cool, but there was warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. She could feel it in the steady beat of her heart, in the way the world around her seemed to hold its breath, as if it knew something had shifted within her. A year had passed since that day she'd walked into the clubhouse, bruised and alone, asking Vincenzo to be her father for just one day. It felt like a lifetime ago. So much had changed. Her body was no longer marked with the signs of abuse. Her skin, once pale and drawn, was now flushed with life. The black eye she had carried into Vincenzo's world had long faded, and the scars she hadn't even realized were there. Deep, hidden ones were starting to heal too. The sound of engines rumbled in the distance, the familiar hum of the motorcycles that had become a part of her life, and she smiled. The men who had once been strangers, cold and intimidating, had become more than just her protectors. They had become her family, and she had found a place in that family, a sense of belonging that had once felt impossible. Every day she spent with them had been a lesson in strength, in loyalty, in what it meant to stand by someone no matter what. Vincenzo was there, standing near the bikes, his posture relaxed but watchful, like he always was. He had never been the type to shower her with words of affection or grand gestures. His love for her was shown in the way he took care of her, the way he made sure she knew she was safe, that no one would ever hurt her again. And that, Ava realized, was all she had ever needed. Protection, belonging, a place where she wasn't just a survivor, but someone worth standing up for. She walked over to him, her steps steady, her gaze meeting his with the quiet confidence she had found in herself. Vincenzo turned as she approached, his eyes softening when he saw her. There was something in the way he looked at her now, a quiet pride, an acknowledgement of how far she had come. "You're doing well," he said, his voice rough but warm. "Better than I ever imagined." Ava smiled, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. "I never thought I could be this strong," she admitted, the words coming easier now. She had spent so long believing she wasn't enough, that she would always be defined by her past. But now, standing before Vincenzo, before the family she had gained, she understood that strength wasn't just about surviving, it was about living. It was about choosing to stand tall, even when the world had tried to break you. Vincenzo's eyes softened, and for the first time, Ava saw him smile. Not the cold, calculating smile he reserved for the outside world, but something genuine, something that said he was proud of her. "You were always strong," he said. "You just needed someone to remind you." She nodded, the weight of his words grounding her. The man who had once seemed like an impenetrable force, a figure of power and intimidation, had become someone she could trust, someone who had shown her what it meant to truly be cared for. As the day went on, Ava felt lighter than she had in years. The bruises of her past were fading, not just on her skin, but in her heart. She wasn't the scared little girl anymore. She was someone who had found her voice, who had learned to stand tall, to fight for herself, and she knew, with every step she took, that she was ready for whatever came next. For the first time in a long time, Ava felt peace. And as Vincenzo watched her, his pride in her evident, he knew that this was only the beginning.